Hi, my name is Torben Jansen and I'm the founder and author of thoughtsonjava.org. When you started to work with JPA and Hibernate, you might have been surprised how easy it is to implement some basic CRUD operations. You just have to add a few annotations and the entity manager takes care of the rest. But when you use it in a real application, you quickly realize that there's so much more Hibernate can and needs to do. Some domain models require the mapping of complex attributes and inheritance hierarchies, or the support of database-specific data types. You often also need to dynamically create your queries based on user input, and some applications even require multi-tenancy or the execution of custom code for certain lifecycle events. Hibernate can help you to implement all these requirements, and in this video series I want to show you a few advanced features you can use. Let's begin with something I get asked quite often. How do you map a relationship between two entities that has to persist additional attributes? Let's have a quick look into one of the lessons of my advanced Hibernate online training, in which I talk about that in great detail. The mapping of this kind of relationship with Hibernate is similar to the table model. Instead of modeling it as a simple relationship between the two entities, you have to create an extra entity for it that maps the relationship table with the additional attributes. That entity has one relationship to each of the participating entities and uses their primary keys to derive its identifier. You can of course also use a surrogate primary key, but the derived identifier is the more common approach. You can see a diagram of such a mapping here. Each book can get published by multiple publishers in different formats. The format is an attribute of the relationship between the book and the publisher entity. As I explained, this requires an additional entity that maps the relationship attribute. In this diagram, it's the book publisher entity that maps the format attribute and the relationships to the book and the publisher entity. Let's switch to the IDE and have a look at the required mapping annotations. You can find the examples of this video in the Complex Relationships project. Let's jump directly to the book publisher entity. It maps the many-to-many relationship with the additional format attribute. The book publisher entity splits the many-to-many relationship into two many-to-one relationships, one to the book and another one to the publisher entity. When you already watched the composite key lecture, you know the maps ID annotation. It's used to create a derived identifier based on the primary keys of related entities. In this example, I create a primary key based on the ID of the book and the ID of the publisher entity. I map both of them to attributes of the book publisher ID class, which is the embedded ID type of the book publisher entity. If you haven't already done that, please watch the composite primary key lecture for more information about derived identifier and the different options to map composite primary keys. And the book publisher entity, of course, also maps the format of the book. The book and the publisher entity both have a one-to-many relationship with the book publisher entity, so that the bidirectional relationship can easily be used in database queries. Let's use these entities to persist and read a database record. I do that in the test create and read book publisher method in the test complex relationships class. The setup procedure of this test case already added a few books and publisher to the database. But there's no relationships between them. I want to change that in the first part of this test and persist that the publisher with ID 1 has published the book with ID 1 as an ebook. I therefore first get the book and the publisher entities with ID 1. Then I create a new book publisher entity and set the book and the publisher entity attributes to define the relationship. And I also initialize the format attribute before I tell Hibernate to persist this entity. In the next step, I used the book publisher entity to get the publisher who published the book with ID 1 as an ebook. You can see the JPQA query here. I used the defined relationships to join the publisher with the book publisher and the book publisher with the book entity, and this where clause to select only the records with the given format and book ID. Then I set the named bind parameters and execute the query. I expect that it returns the entity I created at the beginning of this test case. Here you can see the select statements that Hibernate executed to get the book and publisher entities with ID 1. It then inserts a new record into the relationship table with the given format, book ID and publisher ID. And down here you can see the SQA statement that uses the relationships defined by the book publisher entity to get the publisher of the ebook format of the book with ID 1. As you have seen, you can easily map these relationships. You just need an additional entity to map the association table and its columns. That's all for today. In the next video, I will show you how to use JPA's Criteria API to create dynamic, type-safe queries at runtime. Have a great day. Bye!